Hello and welcome to the first episode of China is Closer Than You Think. For this first episode, I want to start with a simple question. What does China actually have to do with the everyday life of an engineer working in Switzerland? At first, the obvious answer might be not that much. China is thousands of kilometers away. I live and work in Switzerland. My professional environment is European. The companies, standards, customers, and technologies around me often feel very Swiss or European. But the more closely I look at what is happening in engineering and industry, the more I come to a different conclusion. China is much closer than I used to think. I am an engineer working in Switzerland, and I have a cultural background of Vietnam. I grew up in Europe, so in a way, I stand between two different worlds. Europe is the environment in which I was educated and developed professionally. Vietnam is part of my cultural background. And China is this enormous neighbor of Vietnam, and at the same time one of the most important industrial and technological forces in the world. That gives me a particular perspective. I do not want to present myself as a China expert. In fact, this podcast starts from the opposite position: curiosity. I want to understand China better. And instead of only reading European interpretations of China, I want to speak with people from China: engineers, entrepreneurs, researchers, managers, technology specialists, and ordinary professionals who can explain how they see the changes happening around them. When I look at my own field, China's presence becomes obvious very quickly. Think about manufacturing. Think about electronics, batteries, electrical vehicles, solar technology, robotics, automation, telecommunications, equipment, and increasingly artificial intelligence. An engineer in Switzerland can be sitting at a desk in Zurich, Basel, or another Swiss city and still be affected by decisions, technologies, and developments taking place in Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, or other Chinese industrial centers. A component may come from China. A supplier may manufacture there. A competitor may be Chinese. A new technology may reach industrial scale there before we have really started discussing it in Europe. And increasingly innovation itself is coming from China. That is an important change in perception. For a long time, many Europeans associated China primarily with low-cost manufacturing, but that picture is becoming much too simple. China is producing advanced electric vehicles, batteries, industrial equipment, drones, robots, and AI systems. Chinese companies are not only asking, how can we manufacture this more cheaply? They are increasingly asking, how can we build this differently, faster, or better? For an engineer, that is something worth paying attention to. One contrast that particularly interests me is the difference between speed and precision. Swiss engineering has an extraordinary reputation for quality. We like reliability. We like processes that are understood. We test, we document, we reduce risk. We want something to work not only today but reliably for years. These are real strengths, but sometimes I wonder whether our strengths can also slow us down. When I look toward China, I often see another characteristic: speed. Products are developed quickly. Ideas are tested in the market. Manufacturing capacity is built at enormous scale. Technologies can move from an interesting concept to something visible in everyday life surprisingly quickly. Of course, this is a simplification. There are slow Chinese companies and fast Swiss companies, and speed without quality creates its own problems. But the comparison raises a useful question. What could happen if we combine some of the best characteristics of both worlds? Swiss precision and Chinese speed. Swiss industrial experience and Chinese scale. European engineering traditions and the enormous experimentation happening in Asian markets. I think there is a very interesting conversation there. Artificial intelligence has made this question even more relevant for me. Only a few years ago, when we talked about the leading digital technologies, the conversation in Europe was heavily focused on American companies. Today, Chinese AI models and technology companies increasingly enter that discussion. For an engineer, AI is not just about asking a chatbot questions. Imagine connecting AI with production requirements, quality information, process data, and engineering knowledge. Could an AI system help identify manufacturing risks? Could it propose test cases? Could it learn from historical production data and point engineers toward combinations of conditions that deserve investigation? Could it make industrial knowledge easier to use across an organization? Those are exactly the kinds of questions that make China interesting to me professionally. The question is no longer simply whether China can manufacture the products designed somewhere else. The question is increasingly what technologies, platforms, and engineering approaches may originate in China and how we in Switzerland and Europe will interact with them. There is also a cultural dimension to this for me. Coming from Vietnamese background means that China does not feel completely culturally distant. There are historical connections, similarities, and of course also major differences between Vietnam and China. At the same time, because I grew up in Europe, I naturally look at many things through a European lens. That combination makes me curious about misunderstandings in both directions. What do Europeans misunderstand about China? What do Chinese people misunderstand about Europe? What does a Chinese engineer think when working with a Swiss company? What surprises a Chinese entrepreneur about European decision making? How do Chinese professionals view our emphasis on regulation, quality, work-life balance, or consensus? And equally, what could Europeans learn about the motivations and ambitions of Chinese professionals rather than simply talking about China as if 1.4 billion people represented one single point of view? Those are conversations I want to have directly with people. And that is the purpose of this podcast. I do not want it to become a podcast where I tell you what to think about China. I want it to be a place where we ask good questions. Some episodes may be about engineering and manufacturing. Others may be about artificial intelligence, electric mobility, robotics, business or entrepreneurship. And some may be simply be about life, education, careers, family, ambition, culture, and how people in China see Europe. Whenever possible, I want Chinese guests to speak for themselves. There will be certainly be disagreements. There will be probably be things that surprise me, and perhaps things that challenge assumptions I currently have. That is exactly what I want. If I already knew all the answers, there would be little reason to start a podcast. So the title of this first episode is China is Closer Than You Think. A Swiss engineer looking east. And that title describes where I am starting. I am standing in Switzerland looking at the engineering world around me and realizing that many of the forces changing that world are increasingly connected to China. But rather than looking east from a distance, I want to start a conversation. I want to meet the people behind those changes. I want to understand what they are building, how they think, how they see Europe, and where they believe the relationship between China and Europe is going. Perhaps along the way we will discover opportunities for collaboration. Perhaps we will discover important differences. Most likely, we will find both. But the first step is simply to talk to each other. So welcome to China is Closer Than You Think. I am a Swiss engineer looking east, and this is the beginning of the journey. Thank you for listening.